latest technology, the CD-ROM computer. This is a multimedia system.
Kareem, we're also joined by
Hey.
Heather Gordon, Managing Director at Acast. Heather, welcome. It's really great to have you here with us.
Thank you.
And
Excited
the
to be here.
co-chair of the audio committee with me.
Thank you, the co-chair of the
Yes,
Audio Committee.
of course. More importantly,
Yes.
Heather, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So listen, very quickly, let's talk about podcasts.
Okay.
Why are you listening to podcasts? What are key reasons people are listening to podcasts? And how is this engagement different than other types of online content?
Good questions. So typically there's two primary reasons that people listen to podcasts. One is to be entertained. Two, to be informed. And if you look at your own behavior when consuming podcasts, that's probably aligned with the choices
Yeah.
that you make. And the beautiful thing about podcasting that you also know is that there are so many podcasts. There are large podcasts. There are smaller niche podcasts. There is literally something for everyone. The reason I typically engage with podcasts, other than being entertained, is I want to be smarter. I want to learn something. I want to be more interesting. I want to expand my knowledge to things that interest me. And that's the beauty of podcasting. And from an advertising perspective, you can accomplish so many things. You can buy reach. If reach is what you're looking for, you can buy loyal, smaller audiences. If you make knitting products and you advertise in a small knitting podcast, you are going to reach a very engaged audience with a high likelihood that they would be interested and receptive to your advertisement. And the opportunities are endless. And that's part of the reason I love podcasts so much.
Thanks for sharing that. So let's talk about advertising on podcasts, the business of podcasts. How do ads on podcasts differ to other mediums, and really what makes them effective in reaching and engaging audiences?
There's something really special about podcast and listeners. It has been said before, and I know this is something you've probably heard, but there really is an intimate connection between a podcast host and the listener. There is a high level of trust. Podcasters, or at least the podcasters we work with at Acast, are particular about the brands that they work with. We have a number of podcasters. I won't name them, and I won't name the brands they're not willing to work with, but we ensure that the ads feel and the products feel authentic to the podcasters that are working with them. If it comes off as inauthentic, a listener will know that. So we work very hard to ensure there is that fit, and listeners want to support their podcaster. The data shows that this is important to them. If you're listening to a creator, you want them to succeed. You want them to be able to continue to make this content that you are consuming in exchange, typically, unless it's a subscription model, in exchange for listening to a very reasonable ad load. And typically what you'll see is podcast listeners willing to accept advertising in exchange for this content. Whereas there are a lot of other platforms that users will go to pretty great lengths to skip, miss, divert attention. They've got multiple screens open. They can do 5 other things that will allow them to miss the advertising. In podcasting, it's different. There is an understanding. And when the authenticity comes into play, it's easy for listeners to get through the the sponsorship reads. They feel authentic. They feel like they're part of content. It's not like they're being ripped away from the entertainment. It's just part of the flow.
I think that's
So
such an interesting piece to bring in, Heather, of the screening process that podcasters go through. We often talk about this authenticity of the host reads and the
Yes.
intimacy of the setting, but part of that, of course, is embedded in the screening process of the brand integration.
Yeah. So we have, we work quite extensively with our podcast partners when we onboard them, to get an understanding of who they are, what their dietary choices are. If you are a vegetarian, we are not going to suggest a restaurant that is heavily based around a meat eating diet. If you practice sobriety, we are not going to put forward an advertiser that is alcohol related. It's something that we work on every single day to get a better and deeper understanding of our creators. And they're all individual. And, we've got thousands of them on our platform, but the ones that we work with on a sponsorship level, so, they've got a large audience base, for example, or if they're a high demand category, like if it's a small podcast on cricket and the sport of cricketing, that would be very valuable to a client, even though the traffic isn't there. So the relationships that we do have are deep with our creators to best be able to pair them with advertisers. And we also ask them, who are your dream clients? So if we find out that I'm going to go back to this cricket example for some reason, and the host of a cricket show absolutely loves a certain brand of beer, and faithfully drinks it merrily, we will go after that brand and say, just so you know, we've got a real big fan of yours and a really niche target audience that you might want to consider. So it kind of works a bunch of different ways, but it's our job to ensure we're properly syncing brands and creators in a sort of harmonious fashion. Or if you haven't met the brand, we will introduce the product to a brand. So, hey, have you slept on this mattress? Hey, do you want to try this water purifier? I'm just pulling examples out of my head, but and if the creator enjoys them, believes in them, and wants to speak about them in an interesting and engaging fashion, then we'll enter into a deal with the client.
A little plug for cricket, one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing sport in Canada. So
I saw a cricket headline today, which is probably why that it was top of mind with me, and also a wonderful, tremendous sport that should be more popular in Canada. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So Heather, you talked about, host reads and, brands connecting with hosts and vice versa. For those advertisers who are looking to invest in podcasts, what's the difference in, host read ads versus, digitally inserted ads? Is there a difference? What is the difference?
Well, it's digitally inserting an audio spot is just a pre-recorded piece of audio, much like you would hear on radio, for example. However, we have different requirements. We are very careful to capture the tone of the podcast with the advertisers. So, when you look at a sleep pod, for example, we would typically offer a pre-roll, but nothing after that, because if you've actually managed to fall asleep on the promise of the podcast to gently roll you off to sleep, you don't want to be jarred awake by an advertisement for something, and gosh forbid it be loud and sort of rambunctious. So, you never want to take a listener out of the flow by injecting a movie trailer for a war movie, for example. So we work with our partners to ensure that the audio spot is in line with the flow of the podcast itself. And those are digitally inserted. The host reads are actually digitally inserted as well, although, I think the user would be oblivious to that, and it just sort of feels like the flow of the show, and that's on purpose, but they don't need to know how it's served. And that is the host or producer, depending on the specific podcast, talking about their experience with the brand or whatever it is that we decide creatively. But, above and beyond just, the quote unquote host reads or sponsorships, we're also investing and working with clients on larger branded content initiatives or longer host reads, or how, there's 20 different ways to say it. But, at the end of the day, we want to integrate brands in an impactful way. So we just executed some wonderful examples with CAMH. And for example, we used Mark Maron as a partner. Obviously, Mark is a large US comedian, although his podcast isn't necessarily comedy related. It's an interview podcast. And in partnership with CAMH, we used Mark to talk about his road to recovery. Mark is in recovery from alcohol and drug addiction, and CAMH's campaign happened to be around addiction. And we use Mark to talk about his path to recovery and integrated CAMH into that. So a real, meaningful integration, that it was something that was very real and very serious in his life, and very consequential in where he is now, how he got there, who he is. And we managed to leverage that emotion and partner with CAMH to hopefully productive ends to Canadians that are in need or want to learn more about, addiction and recovery, and the fact that it is possible for everyone with the right information and the right support. So lots of interesting stuff happening.
Yeah, I actually, as a regular listener of his show, I did hear that. And
oh, you did?
I did. And I was like, he actually knew to say CAMH, not CAMH. So I was like, somebody coached him on that.
You know what I'm going to say to that, right? Advertising works.
Absolutely. Yes.
I love that you heard it.
Yeah. And so, Heather, I remember as a longtime podcast listener, that, the first early ads were, go visit advertiser.com/name of my podcast, to drive referred traffic to certain websites. And that was sort of the be all and end all of podcast advertising. But now, as ad tech has grown, we now have the ability to build brands on podcasts. We now have the ability to drive lower funnel traffic to websites. Can you talk a little bit about how you're able to create these different types of campaigns, both upper funnel and lower funnel, and the value that podcasts have in to be able to target the different areas of the funnel, marketing funnel?
Yeah, it's come a long way, baby. Even from when I started in podcasting with Acast 3.5 years ago, the technology continues to advance. And I do think it's worth mentioning that could be one of the reasons that audio consumption or audio ad spending is behind consumption. And that is that I think podcasting got labeled at an earlier interval as untrackable. Clients, I came from a TV broadcast digital background, and when digital modernized and advanced, and the level of tracking that digital could offer, from like eyeballs tracking to every little bit of a user's journey in the day being tracked, then podcasting comes along and harder to track. So I think right out of the gates, that was very detrimental to podcasting. And even though the advancements continue apace, it's still been sort of labeled with an unfair reputation as harder to track. And to your point, there are lots of of ways that we track now. We can add pixels onto your advertising creative that will track offline behavior. So you'll actually be able to match a listen with an action after the fact.
Yeah.
There are, there's so many ways to target. We have collections. So all of our sports is available to purchase directly with sponsorships or directly as a media campaign, but we also bucket every single sports podcast we have into collections. And so that means you could get collections and content from around the world, like the Peter Crouch. You know Peter Crouch, that tall gentleman he's a football player, soccer player.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, so he's got a very, very popular podcast in the UK, but he's also got a very high listenership in Canada. So you're getting all this premium, amazing content. Canadian listens only. We understand our advertiser and partners just want Canadian listens, but it all gets bucketed in these content verticals. And same with like news and entertainment or lifestyle or comedy or true crime. So you can buy based on audiences, you can buy based on keywords, you can, if we can negatively target if you want to avoid certain topics. The advancements are fast and furious. AI, another interesting innovation that we're testing is we're taking some of our content and translating it. So we're doing some experiments with being able to take amazing English speaking Canadian podcast and translate it into French. And we're going to see if we can build that audience in Quebec.
Interesting.
And, there's a lot of demand, as you probably know, Kareem, for ears and eyes in the Quebec market. It's since I got into advertising, it's been a challenge to find impressions. It's harder to get. So we're going to actually take really successful English speaking podcasts and see if we can't. And it's a win-win. Can you imagine being opened up to this whole new audience that speaks a different language as their first language, and then being able to monetize and make extra money? And it's just getting started. It's kind of mind-boggling, but so much growth and development and opportunity. It's fun. It's really fun to be a part of.
Thank you for sharing that.
Like that Quebec audience has actually come up in the conversations that we've been having, this like growing audience, but the need, of course, for more content. So it's also nice to hear that there is movement in addressing that, and this is one way to help address that.
It's as a content creator, it's just such an amazing opportunity. Like all these audiences, if the promise, I mean, we don't know if consumers are going to want to hear this specific piece of content translated by a different voice. Like there's so much we don't know. But gosh, it's exciting to try and find out, right?
Absolutely.
And to get then to get the demographics of that audience as well, of the dislikes, and
it's pretty cool. So just to say that I think podcasting may have been labeled earlier on in its infancy, and I guess this is part of why we're doing this today is to create awareness for the fact that it's not your mother's podcasting. If
it's not your mother's podcast.
I don't know if that makes sense, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say.
We spoke recently with Signal Hill Insights, and they've been measuring podcasts specifically here in Canada for, I want to say 8 years now.
Right. Yeah.
Something like that.
9. Yes. Yeah.
And he had mentioned since they started, or maybe it was not that long ago, but they've seen a growth of, I want to say 50%. Growth in podcasts listening in Canada. So we're seeing growth. More and more people are consuming podcasts. They're consuming more than one podcast. So as we see the growth and maturity of podcasts and podcast listeners, as we're seeing ad tech catch up, in terms of measurement, attribution, and so on, what are some emerging trends? What are some best practices in podcast advertising? What should brands consider, really, Heather, to ensure that they're maximizing their ROI, they're maximizing their impact?
Yeah, just like any other platform, just be very clear on what you're looking to achieve. Work with a trusted partner that knows their creators very well,
Mhm.
and work with a trusted partner to be able to build the best possible package. It's the things that we discussed earlier, making sure you understand the environment in which you're buying. Know the creators that you're buying. Know that if reach is what your goal is, then you can go into a sports or a true crime category and build that reach. But if it's that intimacy that you're looking for, make sure that the partners you're working with are known to you, and trust like an Acast to only make recommendations that are aligned with your brand. And the beauty of podcasting is you don't need to come out of the gate with massive budgets. You can test and you can learn for a very reasonable entry point price wise, and gain some valuable learnings for it. A modest commitment versus some other platforms. And then when you stack up the other platforms and you see that there is, only a couple of ads per hour on podcasting versus, and I'm not taking a dig at any other platform, because they all have their pros and cons, but if you want to be one of 5 in a cluster, versus
Mhm.
3 in an hour, dollar for dollar, pound for pound, your investment can go farther in podcasting and a lot less clutter.
There
And
you go.
at the very least, I would think clients should be testing. Again, with a reasonable size budget, you can do some pretty amazing magical things, and to test and learn. Like, you don't need, big meaty broadcast budgets to gain some very good insights.
Absolutely. Heather, this has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. You're wonderful. You must be a podcast host in your other day job, right?
Me, right? You're
Thank
saying it to me, Heather.
Both of you. Dream
No,
team.
I tease.
Team.
I tease. No, thank you. Yes, echoing Kareem. Thank you. Some really interesting pieces that as we continue to do these segments with guest speakers, how consistent some of the points are, and then how different they are as well. But what a fulsome discussion I think, all of these together will be, including this one. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you.